Hi, and welcome to the Conference Rewind video series. I'm Kathy Brennan, the Director of Educational Products and Services with the International Society of Arboriculture. Today, we're really happy to bring you a wonderful forward-looking piece, The Future of Global Urban Forestry, perspectives from young researchers featuring Cecil Konyndyk, Sophie Nieslawski, Cindy Cheng, and Corey Bassett from the University of British Columbia. This presentation was originally done for the ISA 2020 conference, so the viewpoints are, of course, those of the presenters. So if you're interested in a great forward-looking piece with international perspectives from the United States, Canada, and China, then I'm sure you will enjoy this presentation. Now sit back, relax, and listen.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to yet another, I think, exciting session at this ISA annual conference. And we're virtual, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be boring, I can promise you. So this session is going to look at the future of our field, the future of urban forestry. And of course, it could be middle-aged white guys like myself talking about it, but let's not do that. So we're going to actually hear from three very promising young professionals in our field. And we're lucky, I think, as urban forestry, we have so many promising young people coming in. And of course, I mean, there's a lot happening these days, a lot of challenges. We have the pandemic, we have climate change, but also opportunities for our field. And I think in general, there's a lot of focus now on how trees and green spaces can make our cities better, wherever we are in the world. So not only are we looking at the future of urban forestry, we're actually going to have a global perspective. And we have Sophie Nieslawski representing Canada. We have Cindy Cheng, Saohua Cheng, both China and Canada. And then we have Corey Bassett, US and Canada. And these three ladies will introduce themselves briefly. And as you do that, the three of you, and I think we'll start with you, Corey, maybe you can also say a little bit about who you are, what you're doing in urban forestry, and how would you characterize yourself as an urban forester? The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Cecil. And hello to all our attendees watching, no matter, it's the morning here right now, but you could be watching it at any time zone around the world right now. My name is Corey Bassett. I'm from the US. I grew up moving all around, but most of my formative career experiences were in Philadelphia, California, and Hawaii. And that's where I learned my skills in the arboricultural field as well as in urban forestry. And I've been really lucky, I think, to land in this field almost by accident by applying to an urban forestry internship because it sounded cool to me, and really fortunate to be here after 6-7 years later. I've worked both as a consulting arborist, also in the more community sphere, working on community tree plantings, and all of my experiences there really led me to where I am now as a PhD student at UBC, researching urban forest management and ecosystem services. So I think if I were to categorize myself as an urban forester, my entry to the field was strongly in arboriculture, and I think that that's pretty common amongst others. But I feel that I try to bring a broader perspective from my degree in environmental studies, as well as general, holding strong feelings about conservation. So I'm grounded in arboriculture, but trying to bring others into the field.
Great, Corey. Thanks. And I think for some of us, maybe that's maybe to some extent a more common track or path, right, from arboriculture to urban forestry. But as you say, also, I mean, you come from a little bit different background in that sense. And I know, Cindy, in your case, that's definitely the case. You're maybe not a typical urban forester, so maybe you can describe how your path has been.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Cindy Chen. I was born and raised in southeastern China, a province called Fujian. It's actually the greenest province in China right now, with over 60% of forest coverage. That also means that we don't have a lot of huge cities. That's why we get to retain a lot of forests there. And my path into urban forestry was I consider it very interesting because I never really, before my PhD, I never really directly studied urban forestry or worked in the field of urban forestry other than my position with the Bachelor of Urban Forestry program at UBC. So yeah, I think I have a broader and more international background just because I come from a totally different country, and my previous experience is more about natural resources conservation and climate change engagement. So I do a lot of engagement work, which is connected to urban forestry. So yeah, that's how I would like to characterize myself.
Interesting. So you're really, as said, also a little bit of a different trajectory, and then very much into the kind of public engagement, citizen science side of things. So and you already mentioned, Cindy, UBC. Well, I'll say a little bit more about that later, but University of British Columbia is where actually the four of us met, and which is now becoming, I think, one of the driving forces in urban forestry, at least in Canada, maybe in North America. So Sophie, you're Canadian, so you must be proud of that, right? How would you introduce yourself as an urban forester? What's your trajectory?
It's funny, I actually identified somewhat with Corey's trajectory as well. And I think that that's probably something that quite a few urban forestry and arboriculture professionals can relate to, is this idea of kind of stumbling into the field or falling into it by luck. So I did my born and raised in Montreal. So yes, I am Canadian, and I did my bachelor's degree at McGill University in a very interdisciplinary program. So it was an interfaculty program in environmental sciences. And so I have quite a kind of breadth of, and perhaps shallower, but quite broad experience during my bachelor's degree, where I took philosophy classes, biology classes, ecology classes. And I fell into urban forestry because I happened to get a really positive response from a future mentor and master's supervisor while sending out cold calling emails to check in on who might be interested in taking me on as a student. And thankfully he did, and I got funding for my master's because that was really my first foray into urban forestry per se. I did my thesis work on urban forest biodiversity, and I, moved around Southern Ontario, Southern Quebec, and Halifax, Nova Scotia, where I did my master's degree and kind of looked at different development patterns and urban forest composition patterns. And that was really, I didn't even know this field existed, I'll be honest here. So this was 5 years ago now, or 6 years ago now. And I think I was also lucky because my mentor had also stumbled into the field actually quite late in his career. He was kind of a more traditional forestry type. And so I think that lent itself like really well and really interestingly to the work that I did. And I think it kind of emphasize the fact that we can have very disparate or different career paths and all end up in this field and have something meaningful to contribute. From there, I then actually became an arboriculture inspector for the city of Montreal back in my hometown. So I kind of had this trajectory where I started more broadly in urban forestry and research, and then kind of moved into arboriculture. And from there, moved back into urban forestry research when I started my PhD at UBC. So again, similar to Corey, but also kind of different, right? And I think that we each have our own kind of expertise and experiences to lend well to the work that we do today. In terms of characterizing myself, that's a tough question. Thanks, Cecil. I will say that, being really entrenched in research right now, I've become increasingly interested in the future of urban forestry and also how research could kind of advance the field in some way and make sure to kind of bridge gaps between research and practice. I'm particularly interested in the role of technology in advancing the field of urban forestry, not just in practice, but also in research. And, with the increasing ubiquity of technology in urban environments, this rise of smart cities, I think that there are some really interesting intersections to be had between, smart tech and urban forest management, high tech and low tech. And so I think that that's really where I'm situated right now. And, I'm interested to see where the field might go given these two kind of interacting trends.
Thank you. Excellent. That's great to hear. And as already mentioned, so the four of us met we met before in many cases, but we are all at the University of British Columbia, where the three of you are doing doctoral studies right now. And between us, I think I counted, we represent like 10 or 11 countries where we've been working and researching and doing our practical work. So yeah, I think a little bit of a global perspective is definitely true. So this panel debate is going to look at the future, obviously. And I hope a lot of young people are watching and thinking that, okay, urban forestry actually is a future path, a future career that I would like to keep working in. But of course, to understand the future, we need to understand the past as well and the present. So we'll talk a bit about the past, a bit about the present, and then we'll go into the future perspective from your views as young professionals in this field. But you already mentioned your career paths. Is there any specific moment you would say really made you realize that urban forestry was for you? I think maybe to start with you, Sophie, you already mentioned you had this mentor, for example, that really helped you on the way. But is there like a defining moment for you that made you into an urban forester?
No, that's a great question. And I think it comes back to this interdisciplinary degree that I did for my bachelor's. Full disclosure, I thought when going to university, I was going to become an astrophysicist. I was super interested.
Don't we all, right?
Right? Who doesn't?
Me too.
Who doesn't?
I was so fascinated by this idea of kind of combining these two, different fields like physics and like space. And I was really into like the humanities and the idea of kind of challenging who we are as humans through like space exploration. It was this whole thing. And I was 18 years old. So what did I know? But I think that there's always been this need in me to find a field or find a path or a discipline that combines so many different backgrounds by necessity. And, it promotes a lot of collaboration. And I think that it was when I eventually didn't go into astrophysics, I went into environmental sciences. And when I stumbled into, during my master's, this field of urban forestry, and I realized like during my master's degree, I talked to so many different people. I talked to city managers, I talked to, CAOs, administrative chief officers in cities. I talked to landscape architects. I was talking to biologists, ecologists, humanists. And I was like, when will I ever get the chance in any kind of other career path potentially that I could foresee myself in, where I am, negotiating and dialoguing and discussing one project, like my thesis project, with so many different people. And that, I think, really struck a chord with me. It was something that I think I was looking for a really long time that I don't think I had quite found until I was really put in that position. So I think that was a huge turning point for me, was really realizing that it's not just talk. We are truly in an interdisciplinary field by necessity.
Right. Yeah. So it kind of fitted your interest, your personality in a way, and it brought it all together. I kind of recognize that. Cindy already mentioned as well that you kind of stumbled into this as well, also because you came to UBC and there was an urban forestry movement. Do you want to say a little bit more about how the defining moment for you when you felt, okay, now I'm really becoming an urban forester?
Yeah, I was thinking about when is the defining moment. It's actually hard to say because I feel it more and more, and it's just hard to pick one defining moment. I think there are many. But I remember the first conference I attended as a master's student. By that time, I was a part-time student assistant for the urban forestry program that was still under development, so before the official launch. And I went to the Chinese Urban Forestry Forum organized by the Chinese Forestry Academy. And there I met a bunch of urban foresters in China and other places, other countries like United States. So, and I went to as many speech as possible. And I learned this is just fascinating. It incorporates all the topics that I'm passionate about: climate change, engagement, sustainability, greening, trees. So yeah, that's probably one of the defining moments that I feel this is a field I want to work in. So yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And Corey, you were back east studying, right? The East Coast, yeah. And how did urban forestry all of a sudden emerge for you?
Well, it was I think my first entry was applying for this job at the Morris Arboretum, the urban forestry internship, which I'm not ashamed to say is because it was full-time, paid, and gave me tuition credit.
Fair enough.
And so, but those are real things that affect how students make decisions about which careers they go after. Are there jobs that can support them or not? But while I was in that internship, I just was showered with professional development opportunities. And I think that my defining moments all happened at conferences during that internship, where, when you're an entry level worker, you're doing lots of data entry, you're doing lots of, the field work was amazing, but it's still hard to see what the greater field looks like, to see what it means to be a professional in that field beyond just the mentor that you have, which I had great mentors too. But once I got to those chances to go to conferences like ISA and local regional conferences in Philadelphia, I got to see, wow, this is a huge community of practice that I could see myself, finding a place in. And that was what made the transition for me from, just an internship to, this is a field that I could see myself in.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll stay with you because as we are recording this, the world is watching the US, as we often do because it's election time. But we in urban forestry have always been watching the US as well, because for many people, that's the country where urban forestry really came to bloom. So would you agree with it? Is there anything you're particularly proud of in terms of urban forestry in the United States?
Yes, so much. I think, there's lots of technological advancements we can point to, lots of amazing research being done by, for example, the Forest Service and other entities. I think that right now, though, I've been thinking about how much the field of urban forestry in the US gives me hope, and that we are able to have such a thriving and growing community of people across the political spectrum, and that we welcome people, and we all come together with this goal of improving cities and making cities greener and better and healthier. And I think that we have both a community that we can welcome new professionals too, and we should. I'm working so hard to create pathways for careers in our industry, but I think that we also have a message to the rest of the world and our neighbor professions about bringing people together around an issue like trees that I think we can all find some common ground on. So for me, that's what I am most proud of. Is all of the people.
Well spoken. I think that's really important, as you say, as a bipartisan, non-partisan issue, right? Everybody should have an interest in trees and greening because it's good for all of us. So Sophie, let's move north then to Canada. Sometimes people tend to forget that actually urban forestry was coined in Canada, in Toronto in 1965 by Professor Eric Jurgensen. So you must be proud of that, but there may be other things in Canadian urban forestry you're proud of.
Yeah, Canada is such an interesting case, and Cecil, you might agree with this, but it almost seems like urban forestry was kind of sleepy in Canada for a really long time after it was nonetheless coined there. In Canada, we deal with such interesting and often complex issues around the geography of the country, right? We are so huge, so vast, and unlike the United States, we're not kind of evenly distributed, or at least as distributed kind of throughout the country as they are in the United States. So we have this kind of like southern border where most of our large cities, or actually no, all of our large cities are. And so, these enclaves of urban forestry tend to occur in quite these like disparate regions. And it can be very difficult to kind of find connections across. And I wonder whether, I don't know, I would really have to look into this, but I wonder whether that somewhat plays a role in the fact that urban forestry hasn't found quite as much of a stronghold, let's say, than it has in the United States. And of course, there are different governance structures around kind of the federal and provincial and municipal involvement, but we can't deny that there is a certain physical and geographical challenge in Canada that we constantly deal with, not just in urban forestry, but generally as well. And so I think that that's worth kind of considering. I've heard from quite a few researchers and professionals that said, when I started in my career, it was unfathomable to think about doing urban ecology in Canada. You would go to the United States and then you'd come back to Canada. But that's changing. And I think that that's something that I'm really proud of, is that there are some amazing early career researchers who are setting up shop in Canada, doing great urban ecological work, and also, forging great partnerships south of the border as well, but also within Canada. which is, really exciting to see. And of course, the University of British Columbia and the Urban Forestry Bachelor's Program, and now the new Masters of Urban Forestry Leadership, I think is such a great example of this like forward-thinking mentality. I think this incredible kind of collaborative potential that we have, and also the collaborations that we've already forged with China, Europe, the US. I think we've kind of entered a renaissance in Canada of urban forestry, and I'm really excited to see where that will go, because I think it's going to mean a lot of change, and it's going to be different. And I think that we're well poised to kind of explore that more transformative change.
Wonderful, thank you. And I mean, a country where change is happening extremely rapidly, of course, Cindy, is China, where urban forestry recently has really been starting to take off. So is there anything in particular you're proud of? I mean, I know in China, of course, there's a lot of government support, government involvement as well. Anything you would like to highlight there?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, as Cecil, you mentioned, it's being happening very quickly. So just to give you a quick example, Beijing in the past, I think 3 to 5 years have forested over 120 hectares of green space. So basically planting trees on those places in and surrounding cities. And it's incredible, the dance in cities like Beijing. So it's really hard to find space in cities like Beijing. So, and they managed to do that, which is amazing. I think what I'm really proud of urban forestry development in China is how fast and how broad the reach is. So now in China, we have the National Urban Forest City program happening nationwide. It almost have over 200 cities certified as forest cities. They have to go through a rigorous process of planning, urban forest management, and then implement it. And there is a monitoring process involved, and they have to meet a bunch of criteria in species selection, forest cover, in different land type in the city and surrounding the city. And they have to meet criteria, for example, for the access of people to green space. So yeah, so it's really amazing to see such great progress happening in my home country, and the government and people are really recognizing the importance of urban forests.
Pretty rigorous, and seems to be a lot of science-based approaches as well, a lot of knowledge-driven development. So that's really interesting. But of course, we know that we are, and now we're moving to the present, that we have some challenges ahead of us as well, or the field that we have is really facing with some challenges. And maybe also you listening right now, you have some questions to the panel about that, or maybe about some of the things you heard so far. So feel free to put them in the chat, because we'll have a live session after this. But in terms of some of the challenges you see our field dealing with, maybe I'll start with you actually, Cindy. Do you see anything particular from either the Chinese perspective or in general in urban forestry you will see as one of our key challenges?
Yeah, I would say the problem that I see in China is that it's happening too fast sometimes. The politicians, of course, want to see the effects taking place immediately. So sometimes it requires it to be happening too fast, and doesn't give a lot of people enough time to do proper planning, proper management. So again, taking Beijing as an example, even though they have planted millions of trees in the past few years, I definitely have some questions for the site selection and species selection. Sometimes you see trees planted in rows, like what they would do in the traditional forestry industry outside of city for timber production. So and it's just interesting to see that. And there's a lot of potential issues coming with the fast process of tree planting in city. For example, what are the maintenance process, and how are they going to keep trees alive? Because Beijing is usually very cold and dry in the winter. So it might be difficult for some species that they choose to plant on site to survive.
Yeah, so the old tension in a way between tree life and human life, or at least human expectations and political processes, is obviously playing out pretty strongly there.
Yeah.
Or do you see any particular challenge as well in the US or just in general?
Yeah, I mean, since we're speaking with a global perspective
Yeah.
too, I mean, I got my start in urban forestry in a place with a much more, I guess, traditional urban forestry mindset. You know, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, it's naturally forested, and Philadelphia is definitely urban. So it makes sense for, in terms of communications with the public, that yes, Philadelphia would have an urban forest. And I think that a lot of the bulk of the research around urban forestry and practices and tools are oriented around cities in that kind of more temperate forested zone. But then when I moved to San Diego, which is, you know, not not a typically forested place, but yet with our definition, the field's definition of urban forest, which is all the trees and associated vegetation in an urban area, you know, San Diego definitely has trees that need to be managed by professionals, but we struggled with communicating what it means to be managing an urban forest in a place that's not necessarily forested. And then again, when I moved to Hawaii and was working there, um, unless you're talking about downtown Honolulu, most people don't identify themselves as living in an urban area. And I think that that was a big problem that practitioners in the non kind of temperate forested urban city have to constantly be, uh, you know, bringing knowledge from the so-called experts in urban forestry and then translating it to their local context. And so there's this constant like retranslating process. So I think that is a real challenge because we know that cities around the world can benefit from urban greening and urban forests, and they have trees that need to be managed, and they have potential for big impacts from you know, trees in the right places. But I think that we need to develop a better communication toolkit and better methods and tools for all of these different contexts.
Great. Maybe as a follow-up, I mean, do you see,
Yeah.
I know you're quite big on finding new ways of collaborating, right? And bringing in different stakeholders and
Yeah.
so. Did you see any specific examples of collaborative approaches that you think are promising and maybe could be replicated?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that especially in terms of careers and getting professionals into the industry, both, you know, like California and Hawaii, just as examples, have really thriving conservation fields. And there are just lots and lots of professionals who are, you know, couldn't be more excited about conservation. And it was a kind of a struggle to also, you know, work with them on these urban ecology, urban forestry issues and get them excited about, you know, trees in people's yards. But I think that that is an area that we need to, you know, not think of these conservation people as separate from us and as doing something separate, because people dealing with urban conservation are also dealing with urban nature. And I think that that's, we need to, you know, bring them into our fold, and we need to be brought into their fold, basically.
Very true, right? Because we say we're an interdisciplinary or collaborative profession, of course, but sometimes there are still these silos, even for people dealing with trees or green spaces or nature in the city. So thanks for bringing that up. Sophie, do you see, what kind of challenge do you see as really something we have to deal with in urban forestry?
Yeah, something that I struggle with, and this is perhaps less of a tangible, concrete challenge, but it's this idea of change. And Cindy, you kind of mentioned a little bit of this, but this idea of kind of like speed, or how we're kind of trying to go too fast, or we're trying to do things maybe too fast without thinking. And I think that that's a really good point, because at the end of the day, you know, as urban forestry professionals, we're dealing with these systems that can be quite like slow growing, slow going, and it can take a while to kind of get at, you know, changes that are perhaps occurring or responses to change. And that can be quite challenging, both in practice, but also in research, because research processes on urban forests and urban trees can also be kind of slow, right? Not to mention all the kind of admin that goes with research. But something that worries me is that it does seem like more than ever, we're living in times of accelerating change. So, not to mention climate change and the impacts that cities are going to face, not to mention technologies, like that's always something that I'm super interested in, digital technologies. There's evidence to show that we are living in times of accelerating change, right? Think about what the smartphone has done in the last barely 15 years. I mean, it's unfathomable. Think about political climates and tensions. We have seen incredible change in the last few years, not just in North America, where I kind of situate myself, but around the world. And, this may seem kind of broad and tangential and not necessarily relevant, but I think that if we are going to consider ourselves kind of this global discipline, this global field with global practitioners and communities of practice around the world, I think we need to start kind of finding this balance or reconciling how to manage living in worlds or a world and environments that are changing very, very rapidly. So that could be kind of at the city level to the global level, but then also having to manage these systems that don't change as fast often. So what does that mean for our field? And I don't know the answer to that. And I would love to chat about it more, maybe with some folks who are listening to this, but there's like a reckoning, I think, to be had here. And I'm not entirely sure what that means for us and what that might look like. But I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. And yeah, as you already mentioned, right, if anybody has a comment or question on that, please feel free to add it to the chat, because I think this is one of the key dilemmas, and Cindy also brought it up in terms of balancing these different timescales and paces of change. Corey, I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned in terms of the communication challenge. Actually, the next part of the discussion is really about things that maybe have gone wrong in our profession. And I feel that you're young professionals, but I think you have a really good understanding of what's happening. So do you see areas where urban forestry has gone wrong? And do you think communication is maybe part of that?
I think urban forestry is still so young and still figuring, self-defining itself. So I do think that I think I see a bigger future for urban forestry as a broad and inclusive profession. And I think that efforts to define it in really narrow ways are maybe, I don't know, challenge areas, or maybe areas where it's gone wrong. And I think that, yeah, that's a hard question, but I do think that.
So do you think it's a fight, right, on the one hand, of being taken seriously by surrounding disciplines, professions, on the other hand, as you say, the need to be inclusive and to be broad? Is there a tension there, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see in cities, you can see sort of, turf battles over who manages which trees. Is it planning? Do we want our own separate urban forestry department? Do we want, maybe the landscape architect needs to be doing it or something crazy.
Right.
And so I think that we can get like really bogged down by all these kind of which discipline is doing what things, when really I think that kind of everybody has the potential to be contributing to the management of trees, although that's not that concrete.
Great. That's a great segue actually into something I was going to ask Cindy, because it is really, I mean, I studied forestry back in the days, and coming into cities, I was still sometimes looked at as somebody who should not be there because foresters are outside. Now I know in China, Cindy, in this rapid development, there's still a little bit of tension sometimes, and it's not only in China, in other countries as well, between the different fields, right? Foresters, landscape architects, maybe horticulturalists. Have you perceived in China as well that there's still some tension about who is claiming that whole field of urban trees and urban forest?
Yeah, definitely. And that has been an issue going on for a while. I think the reason for this is because urban forestry it's still a relatively new field in China. It was introduced in the late 80s. So back then, not many people studied urban forestry or doing work in urban forestry field, and not many people really understand what urban forestry means. So when you talk about green space and trees and forest in the city, some people in more well-established professions like landscape architecture or urban planning, they may be already doing work dealing with trees and plants and forests in the city. So they sometimes, some of them see that as an intrusion of their territory. So in China, so we definitely see some conflicts between professions in China in some cases. But I think with better communication, more opportunities to collaborate, this issue can be resolved.
Right, and as you say, it's maybe counterproductive, right, to start patching up our territories, given the fact that we actually have to work across disciplinary boundaries and sectoral boundaries. I know, Sophie, that's also a big thing for you. So, I mean, how do you see that happen? The fact that and now we're actually moving almost in towards the future discussion. How are we coming across those boundaries and making sure we are truly inclusive and collaborative?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I'm not entirely sure if we're there yet, but I think that some of what this takes is an open mind on behalf of kind of the urban forestry world, but also on behalf of other people who might be tangentially or more kind of concretely involved. One really interesting collaboration that's taking place right now, actually on the University of British Columbia campus, which I think is pretty novel and exciting, is between a Canadian telecommunications company called Rogers Inc. And the University of British Columbia Faculty of Forestry, Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and the Sauder School of Business, which is the business school at UBC. And this is an official partnership that revolves around this idea of installing 5G on UBC campus. And as you may know, this is the 5th generation broadband networks, promised to be incredibly fast, something like 100 times faster than 4G networks, incredibly low data latency, so you can transfer information between systems very, very quickly. And this partnership was forged kind of both with Rogers and the Faculty of Forestry concurrently, because there was this recognition by Rogers, so a private sector company, that, hey, people are interested in natural assets, they're interested in urban forestry, and we potentially see an avenue for the commercialization of products in municipalities that can help, municipal bodies better manage these assets, green infrastructure. So that's really interesting, this recognition from a telecommunications company, of all people, that, okay, this is something that's happening here. How can we get into this space? And so then, as representatives of the Faculty of Forestry, we're now a big research team and we've brought kind of engineering involved here. We're like, well, this is what we know thus far about natural asset management, which is actually, really gaining a stronghold in Canada. It started in BC. There's kind of a big movement here towards managing our municipal natural assets more effectively. This is what we know. This is what we think municipalities need. This is the kind of research that we're going to do. And to spare you kind of a lot of technical details, essentially, we're going to be setting up an Internet of Things network to monitor trees and natural assets in near real time, coupled with some remote sensing imagery and also data on human movement across campus, to really get at some interesting interactions between natural assets and people, which can hopefully then be scalable at the city level. And we could really, create some change here through this collaboration, through this partnership, which kind of took champions on either side to happen. But I think that this is such a great case of kind of non-traditional stakeholders or partners coming together and creating something pretty novel and unique.
It's pretty cool. Do you think the days of the old paper and pencil recording of tree health and so are gone, or are we still seeing a bit of that as well?
That's such a good question, because I was on pen and paper when I was a
arborist.
Yeah, like only 4 years. But I did see people using tablets too, so maybe it was just me. We didn't have the resources in our department. So I think that there is a shift towards digitization. I think that we are moving towards, moving more into the digital world, and it's at the end of the day often more efficient to do so. I can't even count the number of times I've lost my notes or paper, or it's gotten wet in the rain. Even stuff like that is just really annoying when you're working outside. But a little bit more seriously, yes, I think that especially with kind of this rise of the smart cities movement, this recognition that data and connected technology could potentially enable, more effective delivery of services to citizens, I think that is starting to permeate the urban forestry and more generally, like the environmental management world.
Right, interesting. I know, Cindy, you're very passionate about citizen science, citizen involvement as well, and you work a lot with climate change issues, right? So the climate crisis and what that means for example, for our green spaces and how our urban forest can maybe help adapt cities to climate change. Do you see this as an area of growth and opportunity for our field? And if so, in what way could we maybe capitalize on that challenge?
Yeah, definitely. So this is actually my PhD research projects. I am really always fascinated by the new facts that I learned about climate change impacts on urban forests, and how we are going to deal with that using urban forests as a nature-based solution. I think climate change is already, you have seen the impacts of climate change on urban forests, and this is the new reality. We need to not think about what we need right now for the city, for the residents, also the future, whether the species that we select to plant right now can survive the future climate. This is playing an increasing important role in, I think, urban foresters' decision-making process. And
Right.
I think this is extremely important, because thinking about all the benefits that we are getting from urban forests, it's going to be very important for making our cities climate-proof, resilient, and livable.
Yeah, that's a key message. There was a really interesting article that came out in The Atlantic, I think it was last month, and it was called like Trees Are Time Machines. And like arborists and urban foresters need to recognize that we're like dealing with things that are going to be here for quite a long time. We have to be futurists, like we have to be forecasters, which I think is such an interesting kind of way of looking at our field in a way. And I think it's also a way of reconciling like how to deal with these slow moving kind of dynamic systems and how fast the world around them is changing. Like we can be the bridge, I think. I just don't know how that can happen, but we can be that bridge.
Okay, maybe. Oh, go ahead, Corey. Yeah.
I think that actually, at least the urban foresters and arborists who are really involved in the profession, or industry, are really poised to do this, because my experience is that professionals in our field are highly reflective and seeking solutions, and actually, see problems all around them that they're very motivated to fix. Yeah. And I think that, Cecil asked you just asked us, something that we think the field has been wrong about. I think like two things that even just 6 years in the field I've seen change dramatically. One is, food in urban forests. And I think when I kind of first started in the field, I was told by professionals, you can't have fruit trees in urban forestry. It's too complicated. Like it's a mess. People will complain about it. Just it's not efficient. Don't do it. But I think that even in just 5-6 years, cities are finding that, residents want fruit. They want food in their forests, and that we're finding ways to do that in ways that make sense. And I think that kind of flexibility in thinking is already changing. And then another way, I think, is in the field's approach to young people and bringing new people, more diverse, especially professionals, into the field. And I definitely used to hear older professionals saying, "We can't reach the young people. You guys don't exist. Like, where are you? How do we find you?" But I think that I see professionals more and more reaching out to other partners as ways to, welcome new people into the fields too. So that's something that I see is really developing.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
We'll pick up on that a bit later as well. But as you started talking, or Sophie, you started talking about being a little bit of a futurist or futurologist.
Yeah.
So Corey, I'll put you in that chair then of predicting how the urban forest of the future will look like. What do you think? Are we still looking at similar kind of structures, or are we expecting changes?
Well, I think that we'll be seeing a lot more naturalness in our design and growth and management of urban forests. And I think we're seeing that already in pockets and in people's preferences, but I think that we'll be moving away from kind of that highly manicured, single species street tree look towards wanting more wildness and more natural forests in our urban areas, and embracing the wildlife benefits, mental health benefits of that too.
That's interesting. That actually also links a little bit to what you said earlier, Cindy, about urban forestry in China being very enthusiastic, but maybe sometimes still looking at rows of trees and the same species. Do you think that's still happening 20, 30 years down the line in China?
I hope not. I think there is a movement towards, as Corey said, the more natural looking or feeling of urban forests in the city in China too. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the traditional architecture style or design style of Chinese historical gardens. They are very manicured, and that's what we are used to. So we will plant specific species at specific location for various reasons, one of which is for feng shui, as for good luck. We would like the plants or trees to look like a certain way, so we would twist it to a certain angle, so we think it's good looking to us, aesthetic to us. But I think we are not moving away from that. We are still preserving that kind of culture in the historical garden sites that we preserved in the city. But we are, the urban foresters in China are trying to bring the more diverse and native species into the city, so people can have this connection with the natural environment that they didn't really have before, because Chinese cities, especially the large one, are quite dense, and they usually do clear cutting to get the land first for buildings. So a lot of my generation, if we want to say go hiking, we would need to drive at least 1 hour out of city to get the nature feeling, to get surrounded by the natural environment. So I definitely see that happening in China, bringing the nature back to the forest. And I also see the integration of smart technology into urban forestry as well. So some of the parks that we visit, Cecil, before in China, they already start setting up some sensors to monitor the health of urban forests, but also use it as communication tool for the public. They will show how much, for example, air pollutant has removed by this park. They would also tell like the temperature in this park, and people can compare it with the temperature in the city. I think this is a fantastic way to tell the residents that the urban forest is important, and remind them that all the various intangible benefits urban forests are providing us.
Yeah, it's really interesting in China. It's so much more high tech in a way. And I remember you and I, when we visited some of the parks and forests, that we all of a sudden heard some really nice bird sound in the middle of the day, and thought, oh, fantastic, there's wildlife here. And turns out there were little speakers next to the path that actually helped to get the experience going, right? And also, I mean, many Chinese like having, for example, take music with them on their walks, and so there are, of course, some cultural differences in what people prefer to see, huh?
Yeah. I can imagine my parents definitely would enjoying the smoothing music background in the park, which is not very common in North America.
Yeah, it's almost like you create a kind of a film scene, right? Yeah. But I mean, that must be something for you, Sophie. You are big on this technology thing. So do you think the urban forest of the future will be full of QR codes and manipulated sounds and all kind of technology around us, or is this too futuristic?
Yeah. So I think that we'll probably find some way to strike a balance where there will likely be a little bit more kind of digital infrastructure integration into kind of green infrastructure into the future. I don't know if that'll necessarily mean that we'll see, tree climbing robots everywhere, pruning stuff, and like, right, drone bees like pollinating stuff. I don't know to what extent. It could be maybe in 200 years, who knows? And I think that we will likely be having more and more conversations about this, about kind of reconciling the high tech stuff versus the low tech stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And what that balance might look like. I think that what's really interesting about the naturalness point that Corey brought up is that, these systems, like wilder systems and bringing wildness back into the city, is absolutely, I think, a trend that we're seeing. And these systems can also be highly managed. Mm-hmm. And there's actually some research looking at, using smart tech and actually machine learning algorithms to create more wild systems without human intervention that could actually kind of learn from itself and figure out kind of the appropriate amount of wildness. So that's kind of a perfect example, right, of this combining high and low tech to create a system that actually we do want to see, but we just haven't actually had as much involvement beyond obviously creating the algorithm. But once it's left to its own devices, it could potentially be left to its own devices. So I find that highly interesting too, where I think that these kind of high tech and low tech systems are going to merge to become maybe more and more kind of interconnected, and it's going to be less obvious, what's artificial and what's not. And that's potentially beneficial, right? Because we're still dealing with a lot of conflicts between gray and green infrastructure, and how do we resolve these conflicts and all that kind of stuff. And I really hope that like the advent of smart tech and kind of having these types of conversations will mean that these systems can become like increasingly integrated, and we'll no longer have to deal with like thinking about the very clear kind of like categories of green versus gray and like what these conflicts are and how do we resolve them. Hopefully they'll be a little bit more kind of enmeshed in a way. That's kind of my hope. So we'll see. So I will, though, be a little bit controversial. Sorry, Cecil. I want to go back. I want to go back to a point about communication in urban forestry. Something that worries me a little bit, and this ties a little bit into this kind of low versus high tech conversation, is this idea that low tech green infrastructure trees are like always good. And I see this a lot in like, media communications, and this might not be the fault of urban forestry practitioners necessarily, but there does seem to be this kind of like value judgment that's automatically there, where it's like, if we're talking about trees in cities, great, they are the solution, they will like save the world if only we just can plant more trees. And I got kind of frustrated because I saw an article in The Guardian at some point where it was like, let's forget the smart city stuff. All we need is green infrastructure. All we need is trees in cities. And I can't help but disagree. I think that that's short-sighted. And I also think that it's a bit naive. And that's a little bit of a frustration that I have currently right now, especially with the COVID pandemic. Obviously, we talked about the importance of green spaces, and I'm not denying that. It's true. But I think that we are on a bit of a trend where it's like, there is article after article about how important trees are and how we need to protect them no matter what, and plant as many as possible no matter what. And I'm not sure that in the long run, that's a beneficial discourse.
Right.
So I don't know what you think.
Yeah. No, I think it's important to be nuanced, right? So, and I think, I was going to ask you, as representatives of the young generation in urban forestry, as young academics, etc., what would be the things you would like to push forward? So do you think this would be one thing, kind of a more nuanced perspective on greening and urban forestry, and that actually green is not always good? Would that be something you would like to be known for when you get to my stage, become a grumpy old man?
A grumpy old man. What will I look like as a grumpy old man?
Old lady, maybe. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, when you say it like that, like green is not always good, it just sounds so much less sexy, right? It sounds so much more kind of grumpy.
Negative.
Negative. So I wonder whether there's a more positive way of spinning this. And at least for me, per our previous conversation we were having about these green and gray infrastructure systems that could potentially be like combined a little bit better, I think that's the direction I would want to take it in. I'm like still fascinated by this idea of creating like very novel like cyborg ecosystems where like we can't see where the green begins or ends. When I think about Bosco Verticale, that's like the first iteration of that, right?
In Milan,
and
right?
So,
in Italy, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're seeing designs like that all over the place now. I like to think that that's kind of the first stage of where we might go with this. So I would hope to put a bit more of a positive spin on that. That may be where it might land, but I'm not entirely sure yet.
Thank you. How about you, Corey? 20, 30 years down the line, what would you like to be known for? What difference would you like to make?
That's a great question. I think just, my personality and where I see my own skills is as a connector, socially. And so I think that I, would love to be someone connecting research and practice, leading organizations that do that, and as well as connecting disparate fields together. Maybe following in your footsteps, Cecil, is it more of a broad,
very broad, exactly,
generalist.
Yeah.
But I think that on this kind of positive negative dichotomy, I think that I want our field to have a way to negotiate and express the positives and the negatives, and the services and the disservices through our management. We can't ignore the risks from trees, and while promoting their benefits. We have to be able to manage both, because we're, we see, even in our field, the conversations about the benefits and about the risks are so separate, and yet we're managing the same resource. These are the same trees that are providing the benefits that are also providing, putting people at risk. So we can't ignore things. Like recently, there was a huge settlement for this really tragic case in Whittier, California, where a tree fell on a wedding party, and there were, deaths and injuries in the city. It's recently settled for something like 20 or 30 million US dollars. So just huge, obviously huge tragedy to the family. So we just can't put the important work that arborists and urban foresters do to reduce risks and make trees safe in these really dense environments. That has to be integrated with our discussion of the benefits that we're trying to manage for as well. Because when it comes down to it, it's still the same people. It's our audience here, urban foresters and arborists, who are managing that same resource. So these separate discourses only exist in our heads. In reality, it's still the same resource.
Thank you.
So that's what I'm thinking about.
That's great. That's very thoughtful. How about you, Cindy, in terms of your contributions? When would you be happy with your career a few years down the line?
It's really hard to tell. While Sophie and Corey were talking about their plans and where they would like to be, what contribution they would like to make, I was thinking in my head, I don't really have one clear answer, but there are certain things that maybe a little bit broad because I'm still figuring out that there are a few things that I definitely would like to do. I fully agree with what Sophie and Corey mentioned about communication surrounding urban forestry issues, the services, and benefits. I think what I really want to do is to provide opportunity or support the communication approaches with residents in the city to help them understand the full picture of urban trees and forests. It's not just about positive things or negative things, because sometimes people, if they have a negative experience with, say, a street tree, then a lot of their impression about urban forest is negative. I have encountered some people like that, and I think, yeah, and there are certain groups that really like trees, and they're the tree hugger, and they advocate for tree planting in every possible places in the city, which I also don't fully support. So I think there needs to be a balance, as Sophie and Corey mentioned, and I think there's a need for communication about the full picture, a comprehensive understanding of all the bads and goods coming with managing urban trees and planting more urban trees in the city. And I want to be part of that.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to give you a last question soon, but just to reiterate some of the highlights. And I think, first of all, I mean, you who are listening into this panel debate must also feel like me that we're in good hands. I think this new generation of urban foresters, they really know their stuff. And I think that's really nice to see that in urban forestry as a field, there's a maturity in terms of getting some really good and talented people in who can move our field forward. So that's great. And I think some of the reflections we heard today about the need for communication, the need to be truly collaborative and really try to extend our invitation to other fields to really engage with us, because it's not only about urban forestry, it's about other professions as well, of course. The role of technology is creeping in, coming into our field, and should probably be embraced. But on the other hand, also combined with things like rewilding our cities, which is a fascinating development. And I think we also heard that urban forestry today is really global. And our three panelists have definitely shown that, not in the least also with the Chinese perspective. And we could have another panel debate here with people from Africa, Latin America, Australia, where urban forestry these days is also starting to really take off. Just as an example, Kampala, Uganda is now developing its first urban forest strategy. And I think these are really the things that make me happy, even though I'm a little bit past my early career stage. So before we end up and maybe have a bit more discussion with the audience, a final question for the three of you. There's people coming out of high school, or maybe in the last years of high school right now, or maybe people in a career where they don't really feel happy and they may consider coming into urban forestry. What would be the one thing you would give them along and say, well, this is really something you should keep in mind to become an urban forester who's able to make a difference? And maybe I start actually with you, Cindy, on that. What would you say to them, to these new people coming into the field?
Network. That's how I get into the field of urban forestry. The people in the field are very friendly and welcoming. Even though I don't really have a background in urban forestry, I feel welcomed, and that also encouraged me to initiate the next step to help me get into the field, start my PhD in urban forestry. And don't be afraid to ask people. I think, that's one way to get your questions answered. Also, to get to know more about urban forestry, what are the works being done right now in the field, and what other professions are there.
All right, thank you. So networking, don't be afraid to ask, and keep yourself abreast of what's happening. Corey, anything you would recommend?
Yes, absolutely. All those things. I'm going to turn it around a little bit because, we're speaking at the ISA conference, and I know that, ISA has a generous student discount to attend this, but still mostly our audiences are probably the more experienced professionals. And so I would hope that to our experienced professionals watching this, you are inspired to seek out and mentor younger people in the field. And that I think that all of us are examples of people who did not imagine themselves being in urban forestry or being in arboriculture. And that, there are certain moments that connected us to the field, but there were also honestly years of development of that kind of solidified our trajectory in this field. So if you meet somebody who is, really fascinated by something tangential to this field, there's still a lot that they can contribute if you develop that relationship.
Perfect, thank you. That's a really nice call to action to our many members of our audience, I think, including myself. So, Sophie, how about you?
Yeah, thanks for that, Corey. I appreciate that because I got my first job at a conference actually by speaking to people there. So I think that that's really valuable. I would say as a young person, think about what you may like your expertise to be in. I don't think that it's necessarily ever too early to do that. Think about what you're really interested in. Think about what you're good at. And, interestingly enough, I think that you may be able to find your niche by combining two things that may not seem like they're combinable. So even this example, which is very, very broad, of let's say tech and trees, there's something interesting here at the intersection that's a little bit untapped. Find potentially disparate hobbies or ideas or things that really interest you and go with that, because I think that you may find yourself as an expert sooner than you think by looking at these intersections between things or ideas or disciplines that haven't always connected before. And I think that there's also a lot of novelty and uniqueness there to be had as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks to the three of you for so generously sharing your views and opinions and not holding back. And I hope that will also raise some interesting discussions. So now it's up to the audience to come with some hopefully interesting points to be further discussed. And don't hold back, because I think that's the only way how we can move forward this fantastic field. Not only here in this virtual seminar, but especially also globally in the future. Thank you very much so far.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.